The Mediterranean was silent that morning. Jean Parasat de Valette stood on the ramparts of Fort St. Angelo, 70 years old, his weather hands gripping warm limestone. He had spent 50 years at war. He had been enslaved, ransomed, defeated, and rebuilt. Nothing had broken him yet. Then the horizon moved. 1 ship, then 5, then 20, then an impossible, endless line of 193 vessels carrying 40,000 men across calm, glittering water toward his island. Valette didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment for months. Now the reckoning had arrived. The Knights of St. John began as monks caring for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem. Over centuries, they became something far more dangerous: warrior monks, professional soldiers bound by religious vows who had been fighting the Ottoman Empire for 200 years. They lost Rhodes in 1522 after a 6-month siege and wandered homeless for 7 years, until Emperor Charles V gave them Malta, a barren rock nobody else wanted. They transformed it completely. Unable to farm limestone, they turned to raiding Ottoman shipping, becoming the most feared naval force in the central Mediterranean. Malta wasn't just their home. It was their last stand. Every great war needs a trigger. In 1564, a knight named Romeus provided one. He captured an Ottoman ship carrying gifts to Suleiman, the magnificent's chief eunuch, one of the most powerful men in Constantinople. The cargo was priceless. The insult was unforgivable. Suleiman's response was not diplomatic. It was total. The knights would be annihilated. But the decision went beyond personal anger. Malta sat at the exact center of Mediterranean trade routes. If it fell, Sicily was next, then southern Italy, then Rome itself. Queen Elizabeth of England wrote it plainly. If Malta fell, all of Christendom faced peril. The force assembled against Malta in 1565 represented the Ottoman Empire at its absolute peak. 40,000 men, 6,000 to 8,000 janissaries, elite slave soldiers trained from childhood for nothing but war, Sipahi cavalry, North African troops, the finest siege engineers in the world, 65 artillery pieces, including basilisks, firing 160-pound stone balls. 3 commanders led them: Mustafa Pasha, methodical and ruthless; Piali Pasha, ambitious and impatient; and Dragut, 80 years old, the most feared corsair alive, whose tactical genius surpassed both men combined. On paper, this force could not lose. Malta was about to prove paper wrong. Valette didn't wait for the Ottomans. He went to war with them months before they arrived. Every well outside the fortifications was poisoned. Every crop was harvested early and stored inside the walls. 500 knights, 4,000 Maltese militia, and 1,200 Spanish soldiers were assembled and positioned. Artillery was hidden behind intact masonry, invisible until the moment it fired point-blank into attacking troops. Fire hoops, incendiary tubes, and burning discs were stockpiled for use at the breaches. Fort St. Elmo worried him most. It sat exposed, dominated by higher ground. Valette couldn't make it impregnable. He made it expensive instead. The Ottoman commanders couldn't agree on anything. Mustafa Pasha wanted Medina, the lightly defended capital. Take it fast, establish a secure base, attack the harbors from land. Sound strategy. Piali Pasha wanted the harbors immediately. Fort St. Elmo first. It's small, it's exposed, days at most. Neither man could override the other. Both were waiting for Dragut. Piali won the argument. St. Elmo first. Across the harbor, Valette held his own council. His officers argued, abandon St. Elmo, concentrate everything on Burgu and Senlia. Valette refused. St. Elmo would hold. It would buy time with blood. That night, men took communion at St. John's Cathedral and wrote their final letters home. May 24th to June 23rd, 1565. At dawn on May 24th, 30 Ottoman cannons opened fire simultaneously. 6,000 shots in 24 hours. 1 cannonball every 14 seconds, all day, all night. The limestone dust never settled. The noise never stopped. Men learned to read the whistle of incoming shot and dive before it landed. The defenders fired back with hidden guns, cannons concealed behind intact masonry that Ottoman gunners never knew existed. At critical moments, the facades were knocked out and chains shot fired point-blank into mass assault troops. It bought time. It cost the Ottomans dearly. But it wasn't enough to stop what was coming. On May 31st, Dragut arrived with 13 galleys and 1,600 men. He took one look at the Ottoman artillery positions and immediately began moving guns. Within days, Fort St. Elmo was being hit from 3 directions simultaneously, from Mount Siberias above, from Dragut Point to the side, from the Marsamxett shore below. There was nowhere left to hide inside those walls. The assault parties came in waves. Janissaries climbed rubble with ladders and scaling equipment. Defenders met them with crossbow volleys, arquebus fire, burning oil, and fire hoops. Wooden rings soaked in oil and gunpowder that landed on climbing men and burned through armor and flesh alike. The Turks feared those hoops more than the cannons. Then, on June 18th, a stray cannonball from Fort St. Angelo struck the ground near Dragut's position on the point. Stone fragments flew. One piece caught the old corsair in the head. His men carried him away. 5 days later, on June 23rd, Fort St. Elmo finally fell. The last assault was total. Janissaries climbing over their own dead to reach the breaches. Knights in plate armor fighting them hand to hand in the ruins. None of the knights survived. A handful of Maltese soldiers swam the 300 yards to St. Angelo. Everyone else died in place. When the Ottoman banners rose over the rubble, the numbers told a story Mustafa had not expected. 28 days, not the predicted few. 1,500 defenders dead. 6,000 Ottomans dead, including an irreplaceable number of elite Janissaries. The small fort had consumed an empire's best soldiers. Mustafa Pasha was furious. A month gone, his finest troops bled white, and he was still outside the main fortifications. He ordered the bodies of the dead knights decapitated, nailed to wooden crosses, and floated across the harbor toward Burgu. The message was simple. This is what awaits all of you. Valette received it. He composed his reply without hesitation. Every Turkish prisoner in Burgu was executed. Their heads were loaded into cannons and fired back across the harbor into the Ottoman camps. His message was equally simple. There will be no surrender, no mercy, no negotiation. Both sides now understood. This siege would end only one way: the bombardment. 65 Ottoman siege guns opened on Burgu and Singlia in late June, and the world the defenders had known disappeared inside noise and dust and sudden death. There was no safe place. A cannonball could come through any wall, at any moment, from any direction. Men learned to move low, to press against walls when they heard the whistle of incoming shot, to never stand in open courtyards. Buildings collapsed without warning. Churches lost their roofs. Streets became rivers of rubble that had to be cleared every night to keep the fortifications functional. The night shifts kept Malta alive. While some men fought or slept, others worked, clearing stone, rebuilding collapsed sections with whatever materials remained, plugging gaps that Ottoman guns would find again at dawn. It was exhausting beyond description. Men worked until they couldn't stand, slept for 2 hours, and returned to the walls. The floating bridge connecting Burgu and Singlia became the siege's most critical piece of infrastructure. When one peninsula was under assault, reinforcements crossed. When ammunition ran low on one side, supplies came across. When wounded men needed surgeons, they were carried over. Without that bridge, the defenders would have been overwhelmed within weeks. Valette had other advantages less visible than bridges and cannons. His spy network reached inside the Ottoman camps through Turkish-speaking servants, sympathetic traders, and informants whose identities he protected carefully. Twice during the main siege, intelligence from these sources arrived in time to save the defense completely. Key Engagement 1, the amphibious assault. Mid-July, the plan was clever. Ottoman boats loaded with Janissaries would cross the harbor and strike Singlia from the waterside, where defenses were thinner, while land forces simultaneously stormed Burgu from the opposite direction, split the defense, create chaos, overwhelm both positions at once before reinforcements could cross the bridge. It should have worked. It didn't, because of 1 man and 5 hidden cannons. Chevalier de Gairel had spent weeks preparing a battery at the base of Fort St. Angelo, right at sea level, behind masonry that looked completely intact from the water. 5 guns loaded with canister shot. then round shot, positioned to fire directly across the harbor approach. The Ottoman boats crossing towards Senlia had no idea the battery existed. The first salvo came from less than 200 yards. The cannonballs went through wooden hulls without slowing. Boats disintegrated. Men in full armor went into the harbor and sank instantly. The second salvo arrived before the Turks could turn back. Of the entire flotilla, perhaps one boat returned. 800 Janissaries drowned in the Grand Harbor that afternoon. Simultaneously, the land assault on Burgu hit walls fully manned with reinforcements, who had crossed the floating bridge the moment the amphibious attack was spotted. The Ottomans found no weakness, no gap, no moment of confusion. They pulled back with heavy losses. For one day, Malta had won completely. Key engagement 2, the siege towers. August. When direct assault failed repeatedly, Mustafa Pasha ordered siege towers constructed. Massive wooden structures 40 feet tall, wrapped in leather kept constantly wet to resist fire, built to be pushed directly against the walls so assault troops could cross at parapet level and bypass the killing ground below. The defenders watched these towers being assembled and understood exactly what was coming. Vilette's solution was either brilliant or terrifying depending on where you were standing. He ordered sections of wall at ground level deliberately dismantled, not collapsed by enemy fire, but carefully removed by his own men. Openings were created at the base of the very walls the towers were approaching. Cannons were wheeled into those openings and aimed at the towers' wooden legs. When the towers came within range, the guns fired point blank. The legs shattered. The structures came down. Soldiers who had climbed 40 feet believing they were about to cross onto the walls fell to their deaths or were crushed under tons of collapsing wood and iron fittings. It worked, but it required deliberately opening your own walls while the enemy was standing directly outside them. That kind of nerve was not common in siege commanders. In Villette, it apparently was. Key engagement 3, mine warfare and the Castile bastion. August. The Ottoman siege engineers were masters of mine warfare. They dug tunnels beneath the walls, shored them up with timber supports, packed the end chambers with gunpowder, then collapsed the supports to bring down the masonry above. It was slow, patient, technical work, and it was devastatingly effective when done correctly. The defenders could sometimes hear the digging, a faint scraping sound rising through the stone beneath their feet. When they located a tunnel, they countermined, dug their own shaft to intercept it. Sometimes they broke through into Ottoman tunnels and fought in total darkness with knives and short swords, men stabbing at shapes they couldn't see in spaces too cramped to swing properly. On August 7th, a major Ottoman mine detonated beneath the Castile bastion. The explosion shook the ground across both peninsulas. A substantial section of wall collapsed inward, opening a breach wide enough for assault troops to pour through. Ottoman soldiers rushed the gap, and for a few terrible minutes the siege looked finished. Then Jean Parasat, de Villette, appeared in the breach. 70 years old, Grand Master of the Order, the man who commanded every defender on the island. He was not directing from a tower or a command post. He was standing in the rubble with a pike in his hands, fighting alongside soldiers half his age. When the defenders saw him there, something fundamental changed. If the old man was willing to die in that gap, there was no argument for retreating. The counterattack that followed was savage. The Ottomans were driven back through the breach and across the ditch. The gap was sealed. It was the psychological turning point of the entire siege. The final push, August 19th to 21st. Mustafa knew he was running out of everything: men, ammunition, time, and the morale that holds armies together when rational calculation says they should quit. He assembled what he had left and threw it at Burgu and Singlia in what he intended as the decisive, finishing blow. The largest mine of the entire siege detonated first, opening breaches that assault columns immediately charged. Then more columns came, and more after those, in waves that didn't stop for 3 consecutive days. The fighting barely paused between August 19th and 21st. Men who had been awake for 20 hours were pulled back, given an hour, and sent forward again. Through all of it, the knights were visible. Their white crosses over chain mail showed through the smoke and limestone dust at every critical breach, every position that was about to collapse. Villette appeared repeatedly at the worst moments, not because the tactical situation required the Grand Master personally, but because his presence communicated something no order or speech could convey. We are not leaving. None of us are leaving. On August 21st, the Ottomans stopped. They pulled back to their camps, and the assault simply ceased. Mustafa's officers were telling him truths he could no longer ignore. Disease had torn through the camps, dysentery and typhus killing men faster than combat had. His Janissaries, the irreplaceable elite corps of the Sultan's army, had been bled to a fraction of their original strength. The siege engineers had exhausted their best options. The fleet was suffering from summer storms. Supply convoys kept being raided by Maltese cavalry operating from Dinah. Roughly a third of the invasion force was dead. The rest were exhausted and broken in spirit, and Malta was still standing. By late August, the Ottoman camp had become something closer to a hospital than a military installation. Dysentery moved through the tents faster than any cavalry could. Typhus followed. Men who had survived Janissary assaults on stone walls were dying in their bedrolls from fever and dehydration, and there was nothing the camp physicians could do except watch. The supply ships that should have kept 40,000 men fed and armed were arriving irregularly, because Maltese cavalry operating out of Medina never stopped raiding the convoy routes across the island. Every resupply carried less than the last. Every morning brought fewer fit men and more graves. The psychological collapse ran alongside the physical one. These soldiers had been told Malta would fall quickly, days for St. Elmo, weeks for Burgu and Senlia. Instead, they had been here for 3 months, watching their best men die in rubble for ground they couldn't hold. The Janissaries, the pride of the Sultan's army, had been fed into breaches until barely half remained. The engineers, the specialists who had taken Constantinople and Belgrade and Rhodes, had exhausted every technique they knew. Nothing had worked. Nothing. 3 failures. The siege towers had been the last genuinely new idea. Mustafa had ordered them built with confidence, massive 40-foot structures that would simply bypass the killing ground at the base of the walls and deposit assault troops directly onto the parapets. They were engineering achievements, properly built and properly handled. And Valette had destroyed them by opening his own walls and firing cannons into their legs at point-blank range. After the towers collapsed, there were no more ideas waiting. Mine warfare had produced one spectacular success at the Castile Bastion and several expensive failures. The defenders countermined aggressively, fought in the tunnels when breakthroughs happened, and repaired the damage faster than expected every time. Frontal assaults had been tried in every configuration. Dawn attacks, night attacks, coordinated assaults from multiple directions simultaneously. Every time the defenders had held or counterattacked, or used some prepared position that the Ottoman commanders hadn't known existed, Mustafa sat in his command tent and faced a reality that Ottoman generals rarely faced. He had tried everything. He was running out of men to try it with, and the walls of Malta were still standing. The Medina bluff. Logic said Medina was the answer. The old capital sitting in the center of the island was barely defended. Its garrison was small, its walls were not modern, and its ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. If Mustafa marched on it and took it, he would have a secure base to winter in, fresh strategic options for a spring campaign, and a psychological victory to show Constantinople that the expedition hadn't been a total disaster. He sent scouts to assess it. The Medina garrison saw the scouts coming and made a decision born from absolute desperation. They had almost nothing. Too few men, too little powder, walls that wouldn't survive a serious assault. What they did have was the element of surprise, and the Ottoman scouts' ignorance of their actual situation. They opened fire with every cannon they had, firing at maximum range into empty ground, burning to what little powder remained in spectacular, wasteful volleys that accomplished nothing militarily but created an enormous amount of noise and smoke. The scouts rode back and reported what they had seen. The city appeared to have ammunition to spare. They were firing like men with unlimited powder. Mustafa believed them and canceled the attack. Medina was defenseless. The bluff had worked perfectly. On September 7th, Mustafa made his decision. The campaign was over. He ordered the heavy artillery loaded onto ships. The basilisks, the great guns, had fired hundreds of thousands of rounds into Maltese limestone over 4 months. Loading them was slow, backbreaking work, but there was no choice. They couldn't be left behind. The Sultan would want to know why his artillery was sitting on a Mediterranean island. The loading had barely begun when a rider arrived from the coast. Sails on the northern horizon. Christian sails. Many of them. Don Garcia de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy of Sicily, had finally sent the relief force that had been promised since before the siege began. 8,000 men, Spanish veterans, Italian infantry, Genoese marines, troops from Tuscany and the Papal States, were landing at St. Paul's Bay on the northern shore of Malta. 3 months late. Almost too late. But they had come. Mustafa's fatal indecision. What followed was a command failure that ended the Ottoman campaign completely. Mustafa's first instinct was correct. Embark immediately. Get the army off the island before the relief force could establish itself and combine with the Berga garrison. He had enough ships. The army, depleted as it was, could still move faster than the relief force could organize and attack. He gave the order. Men began boarding. Then he reconsidered. 8,000 relief troops against 20-odd thousand Ottomans still fit to fight. He still outnumbered them. Perhaps one more battle. One decisive engagement against troops who had just landed and hadn't found their footing yet. He countermanded the embarkation order. Men climbed back off the ships. Then he changed his mind again. The army was exhausted. Disease was rampant. Fighting a pitched battle in open ground against fresh troops with a sick and demoralized force was not the campaign he had come to fight. Embark. Leave. The orders went back and forth while his army stood on the shoreline in confusion, neither properly embarked nor properly deployed. It was the worst possible position to be in when the enemy arrived. The knights in the relief column saw the smoke first. Ottoman rear guard units were burning Maltese villages as they pulled back toward the coast, a final act of destruction against an island they had failed to conquer. The knights saw those villages burning, saw the people who lived in them running, and something broke loose that no orders could have contained. They charged without waiting for commands. The Spanish commander, Ascanio de la Corna, looked at what was happening and made the only sensible decision available to him. He ordered a general assault. 8,000 fresh soldiers hit the Ottoman rear guard, men who had been in the field for 4 months, who were sick and hungry and had been losing for weeks, who had watched their best troops die in rubble for a rock that never fell. The difference in energy and morale was total. Ottoman units didn't hold. They broke and ran for the ships, abandoning weapons and armor to move faster. The massacre continued for days as the relief force and the Berga garrison hunted stragglers across the island. On September 13th, organized Ottoman resistance on Malta ceased to exist. The ships that made it out of the harbor carried perhaps half the men who had arrived on May 18th. The rest were dead in the rubble of Fort St. Elmo, drowned in the Grand Harbor, buried in mass graves outside Burgu and Singlia, or lying in the camps where disease had finished what the defenders had started. The largest and most powerful invasion force assembled in the Mediterranean since antiquity had come for a small island with 6,000 defenders. It had sailed home broken, halved, and beaten. Malta had held.